So today we're talking about how small inefficient units can actually be really good in a competitive army list. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're examining a concept that I like to call junk units, including a couple of the smallest, weediest units that you possibly can in an army list, and allowing them to do the grunt work so the main majority of your force can go after the enemy and function as it's intended to. These are basically the units that are the absolute cheapest in the army to field, regardless of whether or not they're actually good. Things like Space Marine Servitors or Company Veterans, Furies from Demons, Tyrannid Ripper Swarms, all sorts of really tiny units that you really don't need to invest many points into. The reason that I think they're quite so valuable in 9th edition is that there's really just quite a lot of advantage in having some extra units on the board, even if they literally contribute almost nothing else to the game besides being a unit and standing in a certain place. These slightly rubbishy little units get a few extra points for being infantry, so they're able to do more actions, being Obsec to help snatch objectives, being durable and hard to remove, and then ideally fast movement or interesting deployment options to try and get them where they're going to be going, whether that's pre-game moves, setting up in deep strike, or just being able to move quickly across the board. They can help out an army in quite a lot of ways, in particular with 9th edition secondaries, scoring table quarters or line breaker are quite easy for these, or doing actions such as raising banners, deploying scramblers, and other various ones from the secondaries, which are all doing the points that win you the game, but it makes sense to have the cheapest and least useful unit do those, so the rest can actually focus on damage output and winning you the game. In general, with these units being so non-threatening, it's really not in the opponent's interest to try and dedicate all that much dedicated firepower to them, when they could be trying to kill something that's actually going to damage their army and try and win the game as a whole. If they've got Obsec as well, they might also be able to contest or score primaries, and just piling more annoying units on the primary objectives can be another barrier to stop them being flipped. While they're doing all this though, they can essentially function as chaff in-game, and chaff units are pretty handy to have around. They can be good tools for screening, say if your opponent has a lot of deep strike reserves coming in, they might be able to stop your opponent dropping their reserves right on your forces, and basically any time a reserves unit comes in and has to wipe out a cheap unit of servitors or company veterans, then the enemy army is basically going to win from that trade-off, as then they can hopefully kill the reserves unit in return. They also could potentially physically move block other units as well, maybe if you have some enemy monsters that need to get in between two buildings, if you have one of these units in the way, then they're not going to be going any further that turn. If these chaff units are durable enough, they could also potentially nuisance charge enemy units. If enemy infantry with heavy weapons are tied up fighting in hand to hand, then that's going to stop them from firing next turn, or again it might slow them up so they can't get where they need to be. For the most part, damage isn't the main reason that you bring these guys. I'd say it's better to be durable than have more damage output, though of course pretty much everything in 40k can attack to some extent, so I would see any damage that they actually deal as a bit of a bonus. So let's talk about some actual examples now then. I would say that these three are some of the best junk units that you can possibly get in an army, and to be honest they sort of blur the definition a bit because they're just fairly undercosted for what they do, and are basically some of the prime examples of what annoying chaff units can achieve in 40k. First up we have the ever-present Nurglings in competitive chaos lists. We've talked about them on the channel before, but they're just excessively durable. They can set up in the midfield to secure objectives from turn 1, they're Obsec, and they're pretty cheap for a minimum sized unit, so it doesn't really matter if you lose them. Your opponent will generally have to try and chew through them to clear the objectives, and that's almost always going to be a win for the Chaos player, as they're forcing the opponent to kill something that's unreasonably durable, unless they want the objectives stolen, and potentially a lot of their forces engaged in annoying charges. Next, Necron Scarab Swarms can fulfill a fairly similar role for the forces of the Necrons. Again, being swarms, they're really quite hard to remove point for point, and in certain distances they can either have a pre-game move and objective secured, or even be pretty reasonable damage dealers in their own right, with Novok giving them AP-1 on their mandibles, and can be really quite efficient at chewing through enemy infantry. Finally, on the Imperium side, I think that Cerberus Raiders are perhaps one of the best examples. These are the Admech Sniper Cavalry, they're very durable, very fast, and they can pre-game move to get into the midfield. Their damage dealing really isn't too bad either. They've got sniper weapons that can try and hunt characters, and at least a reasonable amount of close combat output to try and deal with light infantry. And perhaps their nastiest trick is Tactica Obliqua, being able to jump away from enemy forces when they try and charge them. There are plenty of other good examples out there, and it is interesting to see some of these choices popping up in 9th edition quite so much, where a lot of these were kind of neglected in 8th, as I don't think there was quite as much value in having random units of chaff around. For Space Marines, I think some of the best examples are Servitors or Company Veterans. They're infantry and are very cheap, so they can walk around doing actions or just getting in table quarters. You can potentially strategic reserve them if you need to. Space Wolves can get Fenrisian Wolves. Imperial Guard or anyone allying them in can get Tempestus Scions, who can certainly be tooled up to pack a punch at range, but for 45 points for a bare-bones squad with las guns, they can be a really good unit for doing actions or maybe trying to steal home field objectives. Sentinels and Astra Militarum can be a good example of this too. A cheap 35-point Sentinel with a multi-melter, maybe with a scout move as well, is going to be annoying to shift, and again can help push the enemy back. I'd also like to mention Admech Rust Stalkers as a potential example of this phenomenon. They can do some fairly reasonable melee damage, though they don't tend to be taken anywhere near as much as some of the Electro Priests, but I have seen them cropping up in an Admech list, just literally for their stratagem where they can outflank and redeploy, so you can potentially jump them into the enemy deployment zone at the end of the game, and maybe use that to deploy some scramblers. For Chaos, we already mentioned Nurglings. Demon Furies also seem to be popping up in lists a fair bit more. Their wings can give them some decent movement, and they're at least fairly annoying to remove with their invul saves. Random Chaos Spawn and Cultists are good options as well. Finally, for the forces of the Xenos, Drakari Racks are really quite good objective holders point for point, again very handy in being fairly hard to remove as they go. Tau can field lots of tiny units of drones if they want to push the chaff out. Orc Commandos can often be seen in competitive Orc lists, deep striking in for objectives and actions, and then maybe thinking about charging. And Deathcopters are another example of a really cheap unit that can move very fast. Finally, Tyranid Ripper Swarms are also decent, just 36 points for a unit of 3, at least reasonably tough in the amount of wounds that they get for that price tag, and they can also deep strike as well, certainly going to be included in a lot of Tyranid lists. So overall, I'm not saying that you need to overload on units like this, or even that every single army out there will definitely want them. I feel like I have been seeing these units cropping up more and more in lists though, maybe spending somewhere around 50 to 100 points on these grunt units to run around doing the simple stuff, while the rest of the army focuses on its primary objectives. So as always, let me know what you think down in the comments below. Is it worth sacrificing a little bit of firepower for a few of these units, or is it just best to go all out on the damage output to try and overwhelm the enemy? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we'll certainly be keeping the 40k discussion videos coming, with new videos coming out pretty much every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that I do have a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a few advantages. They get to see certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the channel's monthly prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.